Good.
It's 1 after 7. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to try to keep the webinar to no more than an hour. Greetings. Welcome, everybody. My name is Alec Harris. I'm president at GIA Publications. We're so excited to have you here and have this esteemed guest of panelists and welcome all of you to take part. We have about 153 people so far online with us. If you haven't already, we encourage you to put your name, the city you're in, and any institution you're affiliated with into the chat so we can all see you. And also, there's a Q&A bubble if you have a question you'd like to ask this amazing group of panelists and authors. You can do that with the Q&A panel on, which is at the bottom of your Zoom window. You're not going to be able to see one another, only the panelists, but you can feel free to chat or answer or ask questions in the Q&A. So what I'm going to do is give a brief introduction and welcome to Dr. Jordan, and then allow him to kind of introduce the panelists and ask questions and tell a little bit about the book and the ideas that are really so profound and so important for all of us in this particular moment that we're in. So it's my real honor and pleasure to welcome Dr. James Jordan as the head of this panel, the lead author of The Musician's Being, which is just hot off the press. It's a beautiful book. So excited to have it. And it's, of course, comes on the 20th anniversary of the groundbreaking book, The Musician's Soul, which in so many ways, I think broke new ground, has been an amazing bestseller of ours for all of these 20 years, which opened the door to talking about vulnerability from a conductor's perspective, where it said where conductors were really no longer about being dictators, but being leaders and participants and engagers and evokers of sound. So Dr. Jordan, of course, is Grammy-nominated conductor. He's been recognized and praised throughout the world as one of the leading conductors, writers, and innovators in the world of choral music. GIA has been honored to publish more than 40 books with Dr. Jordan that explore both the philosophical and spiritual basis of musicianship, as well as aspects of choral rehearsing and teaching. Dr. Jordan is professor and senior conductor at Westminster Choir College, and he conducts the Westminster Schola Cantorum and the internationally acclaimed and Grammy-nominated Westminster Williamson Voices. He's also the conductor and founding and artistic director of the same stream. He's done many recordings in addition to his books with us. His latest include Serenity, which features the music of Paul Mahler, and Sunrise Mass, the music of Ola Yelo. And I've known Dr. Jordan myself for over 20 years. Known him since he was a graduate student, and we've been colleagues and friends ever since. And I'm so excited. I've encouraged him every step of the way to write and to be a thinker and to be a leader in our amazing choral world and choral arts. And it's very much my honor to welcome you to this webinar, Dr. Jordan.
Thank you, Alec. Well, welcome everybody. It's a strange time, but it's wonderful that we're all together. Let me introduce just some of the people on the screen, and then you'll hear from them shortly. First, Makoto Fujimura wrote the foreword of the book, but in truth, there are parts of the book are directly inspired by his own writings. He has several books, one of which I would recommend to everybody is called Culture Care. He also has a series of YouTube videos, very recent ones, which I would encourage you to watch. We are kindred spirits. We found out we inhabited the town of Lewisburg, Pennsylvania at the same time when I was a high school teacher and he was just an undergraduate student. I was doing also some graduate work, and so when we compared notes, we know all the same people, but we just never, he stayed in the Art Barn, which is across Route 15 at Bucknell University. He is a graduate of Bucknell. But is a world-class artist, and I would tell you to visit his website. Mark Moliterno is in the room, and I'll have you, Mark, talk about his chapter. Mark is a voice teacher at Westminster Choir College. And he is also runs a program called Yoga Voice, and has a website. He is integrating yoga study into voice study, and I asked him to write a chapter on breathing. He'll tell you more about that. Mike Scheibe and Irene Gregorio. As I will tell you shortly, both of these people play major roles in a way in this book, and I'll let them just talk about that. So let me begin. What I want to do is go for about 30 minutes, and we'll be monitoring any questions you may have. Again, starting with what Alec told you, this all started 20 years ago with this book, Musician's Soul. 1999, when the manuscript was turned in, I never expected it to have any impact other than a few readers, and much to my surprise, it seemed to be the thing that everybody was thinking, but nobody would write, and I was just kind of dumb enough to put it down in a way. Fred Fennell, the great wind conductor, I think it was in year 2000 or 2001, I was at a wind conductor convention, and in the front row was sitting Fred Fennell, and I'm a wind player by trade, and I just couldn't control myself. I thought, what am I doing here speaking? Fred Fennell's in the front row. And he came up and he asked me to sign his book, and I said, sir, if you will sign 10 of your CDs. And then he said to me, he said, you know, I should have wrote this damn book. He said, it's everything I say. And I don't think I said anything new. I'm just reminding people in the musician's soul about things we should regularly teach about. Let me just start and talk to you about Dominic Gregorio. Dom's name is on this book. Dom left us a year ago, and Dom was one of my best life friends. He was one of my students starting back in 2000. He came from Canada to study in a summer course, and from that time on, we were friends. We went sometimes years before we talked, and then there would be, as you know, Irene and Mike, then there's a flurry of communications and pictures and things. Dom kind of worked in cycles. It's ironic that we talked about most of this book. He vetted most of this book. I bounced ideas about him. He actually gave me some things to read. And it was very strange. He really wanted to talk about this book. And so Irene came to Conducting Institute last summer, and we kind of looked at Dom's iPad, or Irene did, and he wanted to write a book. And he said, I'm going to write a book. It's not going to be like yours, but it's going to be similar. I said, great, fantastic. And so he had a sabbatical and was putting down notes. And Irene opened his iPad last summer and shared with me notes, drafts of chapters. And I thought the biggest tribute I could give to my friend was to make him a part of the book, which he really was a part of. So Mike Scheibe was one of Dom's teachers, and obviously Irene is his sister. Irene holds a DMA in piano accompanying and coaching from USC. She's a University of Michigan graduate, so she's a musician in her own right. So who wants to go first? Mike, do you want to go first and talk about Dom a little bit?
Sure. Dom was my first TA at the University of Southern California when I arrived in 2008. I was hired back in 2007 and took a year for my family to make the adjustment to Southern California, back to Southern California. It was returning home. Dom was center. Dom brought, out of the chaos of having a program and reimagining the program, Dom was always the person who said, we can do that. We can make that happen. And he had a calming presence on all of us, Irene included, who was my pianist for my collaborative artist, let's call it what it is, in the USC Chamber Singers for 2 years. So the first year I had 2 Gregorios in my ensemble. one at the keyboard and one as my assistant. And Dom was this, first of all, stunning musician. He had a degree from Temple in conducting and a degree in voice, and was wonderful at diction and a fabulous singer, and just found a way to, if you will, herd all of the animals in the room. In other words, all of the singers who weren't quite sure what I was doing was the right thing. But Dom also knew one of my students from the University in Miami, which I had no idea had happened, but they had been talking during the transition of my travel from Miami to USC. Centered, spiritual, got along with everybody. There's nobody he didn't get along with. Hardworking, intuitive musician, beautiful person in and out. And I think the hardest part of starting to read this book is to recall all those moments, because here's this young man who I met in 2007, became my TA because of that interaction that we had during my visit. And I just can't speak highly enough about him as a person, as a human being, as a mover of music and a mover of art, all the way around. So Irene, thank you for being part of that journey with me at that first junction. And you know what I'm talking about.
Yes,
Chaos
absolutely.
as I walked in. Why don't you take over?
Okay, well, I remember running around like weasels with Dominic in Scheibe's office, the hub of the music building. So we would be, I would often read scores with Doc, and Dominic was there. It was just like a kind of constant happy hang, filled with activity. And I'm so grateful for the time that we had there at USC, because Dominic and I grew up together, and I'm speaking here from our home in Guelph, Canada. As soon as I went away from home and went to school, he did a couple of years of schooling in Guelph, and then he ended up at Temple. But there was about 7 years or so that we were apart, and then we magically converged again at USC, a little bit randomly, but and then I found myself as the accompanist for the choir. So it was just like when we were kids collaborating together again, and that was I was so glad to rediscover my brother in grad school, and we saved each other's butts many times. He sang for many of my lessons. I did all of his excerpts for his dissertation on Sibelius. We were both we both went through some really interesting trials. We lived in places in not so hot areas of LA and just helped each other out. And there were just so many really, really funny stories and great times that I will always treasure from that time. But speaking of my brother, because we've had all of this time in COVID isolation, I've decided to attack some of the boxes in the basement that I've been hiding, for decades, and going through some of Dominic's things from our childhood, and it's a very bittersweet experience, but just remembering a lot. As Doc said, he was a very hardworking person. There are many things that came naturally to him. For example, he could do the entire Super Mario Brothers game in a couple of hours. He could beat it all the way to the end. I remember when we were 8, we learned chess at the library. In less than a year, Dominic played our chess master, who was probably in his 30s, and beat him, and was, just very naturally gifted at many things. And then there were things that took a little bit. Like in high school, we all ran track, and my other brother Jonas and I were really into running hurdles, and we were quite successful. Dominic tried to run hurdles. We would see him sweating around the track, running around. He didn't do so well at the hurdles, but he worked his butt off, and that was Dominic. And he just had a zeal for so many interests, languages, all of the different types of mindsets that you would explore, thinking in different languages. He was at once a person who was very down to earth and a mental age of 10, but also wise beyond his years, just, like timeless. He just had a very old soul at the same time. And I haven't finished reading the book yet, but what I have read absolutely resonates with everything that's based on what he believed in from his extensive study of many religions, from the Christianity that we were raised with. He was really into Buddhist thought and philosophy. At one point, we were all given Eckhart Tolle, and another summer, the I Ching. He studied a lot of yoga and went to Rishikesh to do yoga teacher training. And at the latest spiritual, when we were in LA, he was very much involved with Agape. And lastly, the Course of the Miracles was his latest spiritual influence. So all of that study informed his approach to music, absolutely. And some of his students who are here tonight can attest to that. And I think the students also would agree that when we lost Dominic, he was a light. He would light up a room. He was just so full of joy, so positive. That 10-year-old self was ever present. He was very playful in rehearsals. But we were all very much looking forward to the book that he was writing, that would be based on a lot of the study with Dr. Jordan and all of the spiritual things that he had called in his teaching. I think in particular, I felt a great sense of grief because Dominic and our family, as many other families, have gone through the immigrant experience, and there's a lot of untold experiences that absolutely shaped his worldview and his understanding of others who had gone through some of those experiences. So at his death, he was in the middle of starting a Filipino choir, where he was really starting to explore his indigenous roots, his indigenous Filipino roots. So with the loss of all of that, the promise of the writings, this extraordinary act of love that James Jordan has done in collecting the writings and knowing Dominic so well, I couldn't have trusted anybody more to do this task than James. And I made it a point this summer to get to know him because he was such a formidable person in Dominic's life. In fact, James, I think I found some pictures of you. Was your hair black 20 years ago or dark?
Yes, it was.
Okay, and did you wear glasses? I think I'm going to send them to you, but.
Yes, that's a painful thing, but yes, when I went to Westminster, it was black. And,
okay, those pictures are of you of that summer in Westminster. And it's like, it's to read the book makes me feel so close to Dominic, and it gratifies me to know that he had such a life friend in you, and that these thoughts and these expressions have a home now in the book.
Thank you, Irene. Well, let me just give you an introduction, and I'm going to go straight to Makoto Fujimura after I just lay out a couple of things. So the book is based upon, I don't know about all of you, but with me, sometimes I hear one phrase and it sets off an alarm, wanting an idea. And this book is based upon one simple phrase. I was in Westminster Conducting Institute maybe 3 years ago, and Donald Nally was teaching. And Donald, as you may or may not know, is director of The Crossing and has done some very innovative, socially oriented commissioning of music. And I admire Donald greatly. We have been friends since my days at Hart. And he was conducting, and he was trying to get everybody that was singing to breathe. And they took a breath on his gesture, and then he stopped dead and he says, no. I just don't want you to breathe. I want you to breathe as me. And the word "as," I thought, what in God's name is as? So the whole book is an exploration of the word as, a drilling down on the themes, some of the themes of musician soul. But the big change here is that what I found, and I know Mako knows this from being at Oxford, teaching, conducting all these years, I have run out of ways of explaining, I don't want to say dumb things, but they end up being dumb when you're trying to explain something you can't explain. And that teaching in the place where C.S. Lewis taught initially introduced me to the power of metaphor. He once said that C.S. Lewis said, that the greatest things in life you cannot describe only through metaphor, only indirectly. And so the book is also a collection of metaphors, which I'll go through, just highlight some of them. And some of them are more direct. Obviously, what Mark Moliterno talks about is a little bit more direct. But the first metaphor I stumbled on was I saw on Twitter that Mako made a couple of years ago about kintsugi. And on the cover of the book, you see a bowl repaired in gold. And that metaphor, which I don't want to steal from my friend, I will let him describe the metaphor and why even now it's even more relevant because of what we're going through. So, Mako, I don't want to explain it. Will you please talk? Thank you.
Absolutely, James. Thank you for inviting me to this such an important conversation about being able to be fully human at this time, and which is very hard especially for choir directors and people who sing together in a community. And kintsugi came to me very early on as an artist. I was studying traditional Japanese art form to apply to my contemporary paintings. And I heard about kintsugi tradition, but I didn't know much about it until recently when I thought about the fractures of our time, and especially after 9/11, I was a ground zero resident. I lived 3 blocks away from the towers, and I had 3 small children, so we were directly impacted, and we stayed in that region, our children becoming ground zero children. But and I learned about kintsugi form back then, and I have a 18th century teaware here with this really beautiful kintsugi design, as you can see. Kintsugi is mending the fractured teaware. It started as part of tea tradition, and 15th century kintsugi as an art form you can trace it back to China in 10th century. We were documenting some of that for a newly launched Kintsugi Academy, and we wanted to see the history of it, but it was refined in 16th century Japan as part of Rikyu's tradition of tea, ceremonial tea, which is a form of peacemaking in Japan. And it grew out of that. And instead of throwing away broken teaware, they began to mend the fractured bowls with Japan lacquer. Japan lacquer is a very complicated craft tradition, and it takes about 5 years to master the craft. And Japan lacquer is very slow drying. It takes about a year to dry under moisture of Japan, which it has to be moist to dry. And then the kintsugi master will design it knowing that the fracture, even this bowl, you can kind of tell this flow here. The edge is not round, but intentionally made into a little bit of an indented form to accentuate the fracture. They, instead of hiding the fracture, they will show forth the fracture with gold, showcase it in some way, highlight it in to make it significant. And this idea, it's connected to Rikyu's idea of Wabi-Sabi Tsuki, which is 3 of the tenets of Japanese aesthetics. And it's, again, taking value of things that we would normally throw away in consumer culture, instead saying that fracture itself, the fragments are themselves beautiful. And so many ways of applying this, and we have been training people to do kintsugi themselves. We found a way to do kintsugi without using the traditional lacquer. We found a new lacquer to still authentic, and but it takes an hour and a half to dry instead of 1 year. James was part of, Dr. Jordan was part of our first kintsugi workshop in Princeton. And what I observed confirmed in me the universality of this metaphor as something that we all need to experience. And Dr. Jordan was one of the first to recognize that. I would say that this communal way that conductors work is directly connected to not hiding the flaws, but to in some ways behold the fragments and try to accentuate that with gold and splendor of what what a crack in bowl can give us, a new light, a new creation. And it was interesting observing James at the workshop, because he is a master of nonverbal cues. And he pointed out to me afterwards, as people were coming in and we had set up these fractured bowls to work on, he said, by the way they looked at or they chose a particular bowl with particular crack or fracture, you could already tell what their journey might have been like or what they were struggling with. So I look forward to this conversation with him and all of you in days to come. But it is in such a time as this, we are going through such a fracture that will not be fixed right away. It will require some very careful mending, and also highlighting, hopefully, with gold. And that's also applied to our lives, that we need healing, that is not industrial fixing, but it is part of our human story, the songs that we sing to bring gold into those fractures.
Thank you, Mako. The big change is that the metaphor for me is that I think what conductors do, and many musicians, is we all have life traumas, loss of family, whatever it may be. And see, it dawned on me that we tend to push things down. All of us do. I know, because I'm a student of Elaine Brown. She was always dredging. She was the original Kintsugi bowl repair person. She kind of had a perceptive sense of issues and didn't want you to speak about the issues, but she knew they were there. And this not hiding sense is part of the breathe as me, to breathe as you are. And last summer at Oxford, it had an incredible impact upon the conductors conducting the lecture. And then Mako gave some other lectures that also had an incredible impact. So that's one of the things. Let me just talk about briefly a couple other high points of the book. There's neurology in the book, which I'm always fascinated with. Antonio Damasio, who was at USC, has several books on the relationship of art and neurology, and how we actually process music and emotions and feelings. And the one thing that really kind of blew me away in my reading last year was there is a difference between emotion and feeling. Emotion is that quick surge of maybe goosebumps or something, some musical effect that makes an effect on you, and it's kind of has a half-life and it goes away. And then there are those musical experiences that stay with us for our whole lives. There is a difference. And what he has said neurologically is that emotions are very quick and they have the shortest neurological pathway in our brain. They can happen and they can happen fast. Feelings are different than emotions, and this is what kind of, there's an illustration in the book that I actually took and adapted from his book. But feelings go a whole nother neurological route. It takes longer, it takes more time. And the difference between them, I think, is an important distinction to make when you're trying to figure out, when you're breathing, who are you breathing as? Are you breathing as the emotive guy, or have you done some real kind of digging of experiences? Gestural, I talk about gestural issues that disturb the human ecosystem of singers, that even though if you're not aware of what you're doing with your body, what you transfer through your body will come out. So the whole issue, if you haven't figured out breathe as me, then what happens in your hands tends to confuse the picture. I wrote a chapter on the loneliness of musicians. In truth, we're all introverts. I mean, Mako sits in his studio and paints for hours of a day, and he takes hours to mix his paint. I don't know of anything more introverted than that, sitting in that studio in Belmead and mixing your paints. Those of us who practice, those of us who study scores, those of us who teach, there are times of this, we like introversion, and it's not a bad thing. Dom's chapters deal with music as gratitude. And truth be told, probably my favorite chapter, even though it's short, I didn't want to go on with his notes. I left them pretty much as it is. But one of the things he kept on telling me is that, James, you should have much more gratitude for the singers that sing for you. You should be finding different ways of expressing it non-verbally. And we talked a long time about that. And I think his words and his turn of the language in the last two chapters is obviously the most important part of the book. Mark Moliterno, I have known since since he came to Westminster. He is one of our, basically, Mike, I can tell you that when a student fills out an audition form for my choir and they say from his studio, it's come here, come to this choir, mainly because I know he educates his students not only about singing, but about themselves. I asked Mark, because of the yoga work, to try to describe this breathe as me thing from the viewpoint of a yogi. And I will say this, that this is my little hat tip to Dom. Had Dom been around, Mark, I'm not sure I would ask you to write the chapter. I'm only kidding. I think I would ask both of you to write the chapter. But yoga was so much a part of his practice and his centering and finding his internal constitution. So could you just briefly, because we are running a tad longer than I thought, but I want you, because your chapter is incredible. Mark also has a chapter in the Musician's Breath book that was published in 2006. Okay. And also there's also a DVD with that where he does a yoga class for musicians, singers. And it's 90 minutes, I think, on that DVD or close to it, and it's spectacular. Mark, you want to describe what you tried to put in this book, my friend?
Well, I'm very moved by this conversation, actually, and I think it's beautiful. It's the essence of what I believe my life's work is with yoga and singing. The theme of my chapter is essentially, when you gave me this idea of breathe as me, and that's all you told me. You didn't give me any of this other information that I'm hearing tonight. So I had to go away, and I went back and I thought about, what does this mean? What does this really mean? Are we going to talk about breathing? Are we going to talk about, what does it mean to breathe as somebody? And I realize it's about the separation that appears to be between people when we make music, but which is really an illusion. And the quality of separateness that we experience and which we take for granted when we sit in front of a conductor or when a conductor stands in front of another person, that separateness is actually an illusion, but we believe in it. And we believe in it because of the structure of ego that we all carry. So then I started to think about how do you begin to bridge that gap? And yoga says a lot about that. So I begin the chapter about in discussion about breathing, because breathing is the one thing that we all share. Breathing is the same thing for everybody. It's the first thing we do when we come into the world. It'll be the last thing we do when we leave. And I often say that our life begins with an inhalation, it'll end with an exhalation, and life is what happens in between. So we breathe. Breathing is the thing that we share. So I talk a lot about that, and I talk a lot about the breathing patterns that carry thought, and how thoughts are united with breathing, and a lot of that sort of understanding of self in order to be able to breathe as another, or to be able to stand on the podium and ask someone to breathe as you, requires your self-knowledge. So that's the starting point. We look at breathing, we understand breath, and try to understand breath. And then breath becomes then a focal point. Breath becomes a point of concentration for awareness. And awareness is the starting point for beginning to dissolve the ego structures and beginning to work with the ego structures. So I don't believe in dissolving them. That's an incorrect statement. I believe in working with them. And just like I was very taken with Makoto's what he just said, and I wrote it down, not hiding our flaws, but accentuating them. And I think yoga teaches this. I think that in its essence, yoga is about understanding where the brokenness is, and where the separations are, and where the imbalances are, and then working with them to unite them again, to bring them back into a wholeness. And so when we talk about ego and dissolving or working with the separation that is inherent in human beings, that's the work of meditation. And so the second half of my chapter then is about meditation, explaining what yoga says about meditation, what are the yoga techniques that are taught about meditation, and the 3 stages of meditation, the ability to concentrate, and then prolong that concentration, and then ultimately unite with the object of your concentration. And so I try to tie that together and use the yoga, the model and the paradigm and the teachings to bring this idea of wholeness and unity out of the brokenness and out of the separation.
Thanks, Mark. And one of the last things I want to talk about, because I did, as you all know, if you've read my other books, I try not to, I try to give credit where credit is due. The other concept that I became fascinated with because of Mako and his writings and is this concept of slow art. I think, however, my friend Mako, I think some of our job is done for us, because whether we like it or not, we're in slow art. We're alone. Things have slowed. I mean, my friend James Whitbourne, I sent him a picture. I went up the road and I stopped and looked at some sheep. And I said, aren't these beautiful animals? And he wrote back and he says, isn't it incredible that we now start seeing things that we've never noticed before? And I think as artists, this idea of slow art, I think what yoga does, and I think to breathe as me, I think we have to slow our perception down. I think our world has to slow down. And this is a thing Dom was a master at, because he was always telling me I go too fast and I need to calm down. He didn't say the word calm down. He would use the word slow. Mako, can you briefly describe this slow art? Because I do talk about it in the book a little bit, and we talked about it last summer at Oxford too.
Yeah, so I practice this traditional form of making your own paint, it harkens back to 17th century Japan, where you get mineral pigments and you mix it with Nikawa glue, which is animal hide glue, water-based, but it takes about an hour to even get ready to do the work every morning. And so you really do have to slow down, and there are faster ways of painting, with acrylic, but I have intentionally used 17th century materials, all natural materials, by the way, and so it has become part of the focus is not just to slow down, but to pay attention to the process, and paying attention to the process will do so many different things about the final outcome. And so you're paying attention to the materials, you're basically listening to the materials to speak to you. As I paint, the layers take time to dry. I am watching paintings dry, basically, in my studio a lot of times, and yet that process is very healing to me, because I hear sound, actually, and I am connecting with a deeper reality of what the paintings are trying to, paintings are trying to reveal themselves. So I'm trying to get out of the way, and that part of the process is very much it's very transgressive against the current cultural climate in reality, especially in contemporary art, where I showcase my work. It is the opposite of Andy Warhol's 15 seconds of fame, but at the same time, I think there's something very timely about that that is needed, especially right now.
So, Alec, if there are questions, that was a heinously short overview of the topics in the book. And I want to say to everybody that reads it, I've kept the chapters purposely short, because what I've tried to do is just give enough information for you to begin thinking. There are quotes in this book like are in every book of mine. And I will say this to you, like my students will attest. The reason for the quotes is I think sometimes in those quotes, there's better information than what I'm writing. I see no reason to restate something that Makoto Fujimura said. I'll just quote him. And then if you have time, go read his book or whoever I'm quoting. And so some of the chapters are short on purpose because I kind of let you hanging. I throw out a concept and then I run to the next one on purpose. I just think musicians need to think and interiorize what this art is about, and take time with themselves. So in a way, this is a drilling down more seriously, deeper on some of the aspects of the musician's soul, but also expanding the breadth of knowledge, maybe, or the metaphors. It's a lot of metaphors. Another time, Mako can tell you about a lecture he gave on a book by Lewis Hyde called The Gift. And this whole book is kind of flipped me out because it just talks about how we have gifts to give as artists. And I'm not so sure we're always in the gifting mode or realize what an incredible gift we give. And that's a whole nother subject, but I also kind of drop that in. So they're short chapters, I apologize, but I think it's enough so that you can all begin thinking on your own. Alec, are there any questions?
Yes, there are a couple of questions. The first one from Joel Mitchell-Chuck.
Yeah.
And the first thing I would just encourage all of you to please, if you do have questions, put them in the Q&A window and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can. His question is in the chat. It says, how can you encourage your students or yourself to move past the fear of vulnerability and toward allowing their imperfections to be a part of their performance?
Joel, I saw your name, my friend. Joel sang with me for years at Westminster and is in same stream and is actually on the Mueller recording that just came out. Joel, I have no secret thing other than to keep talking about metaphors like kintsugi, like slow art, like the difference between feelings and emotions. I think awareness is part of the battle. Talking about, if I can say, Mako, I've used David Brooks's two of his articles. The most recent one I shared with Mike Scheibe's class, and he said, we have to stop coddling our children. And by that, Joel, I think as a millennial, forgive me for the word, I think we have hidden the realities of the world, not on purpose, but this article by David Brooks talking about the healthcare workers that have been trained to confront very difficult issues. That is part of their training, but in the rest of the world, we're coddling. And now everybody's like, can't deal with this. And I find David's book called The Second Mountain is incredibly helpful for people looking on how, what you're asking, Joel, is David's metaphor is two mountains. And one is the things you're supposed to achieve, and the other things are the things you really should achieve, if I can summarize David's writing. But we're stuck in the valley. We're stuck at low points in our lives. How do you, and it's, as David says, how do you get out of a valley? I mean, I'm quoting him. And it's rough work. It's hard work. And if I would also tell you, look at Mako's videos, but this is something that just requires patience and time and quiet. I think, Mako, you have anything to say to Joel?
I was gonna say that I was reading that question. I thought it was an amazing question, and I have to address it in my YouTube sessions because students send me these questions, and they're invaluable to me as someone, a practitioner of the arts. But you know, these questions open up all sorts of possibilities. Yeah, vulnerability it takes courage to walk through, and it's not something that is easily taught, but I think it's part of the culture of our communities that is very important to consider, and part of what I suspect that is difficult about this time is that we are disconnected from our communities in one-to-one level. And when I was at Oxford listening to choirs members practice, I had a visceral sense of how connected you are intuitively. And that obviously is because a master choral director makes it that way, makes that possible. But I think there's some human capacity that allows us to be more courageous, to be more vulnerable. And that's what I think choir as an art form can teach us, perhaps more than any other art forms. And so for me, when I try to help a younger generation find their voice, the one thing I do talk about is this journey of being able to recognize your vulnerability, as Mark mentioned. Trauma counselor came into a Kintsugi Academy workshop, and she said that this is the number one thing that I'm trying to do with my trauma patients who come in for therapy. I try to tell them we can't fix this, but it's so hard for them to see that. But if you can admit that this issue, trauma, cannot be fixed, but it can be mended, it can be made new. But the entry point is the fracture. Entry point is admitting that I do not have the power to fix this, and that takes enormous courage. But to me, that's the entry point for any art, to be authentic, to be enduring. It has to begin there.
May I just offer one quick thing? I know we probably have to get, but I wanted to say hi to Joel too, because he was my student as well. the point of vulnerability is that it will affect our breathing, and it will affect us because we become defensive against vulnerability. And yoga calls that aversion. It's one of the kleshas. It's one of the hindrances to our consciousness. So with what we want to work with is actually moving close to that vulnerability and recognizing our tendency to push it away, which actually reinforces the ego structure. And so what we want to begin to do is begin to move toward it and find actually that when we breathe into it, it tends to become part of the creativity rather than the thing we have to try and avoid.
One of the things I just want to share before we end this evening is trying to practice. Since you're all listening, I'm going to tell you, I didn't say it in the book, but if you put 2 and 2 together, you're going to get 4. I have on my other desk in my study a book which I stumbled on a couple weeks ago, and it's by Paul Tillich, and it's called The Courage to Be. It was written years ago, and I love the title of the book. I think it takes courage to be, and in the book, there is a chapter trying to twist and to turn another story about what vulnerability is. And basically the story is this. 2 years ago, you all know the horrible story that's going on at Westminster and about moving to another campus and about on and on. So 2 years ago, picked the choir, went into rehearsal, and it was a good choir. Mike will tell you, immediately when you got it. It's going to be a nice ride. And I thought to myself, this is a phenomenal choir, and I am going to make it better. I am going to really teach, and so I wasn't mean. I think I was on top of every problem, immediately calling out this, calling out that, kind of, ringmaster, 3 rings. I mean, and it was not kind of the way I do a rehearsal, but I thought I was great. Things were getting done. I did notice the sound a little weird, but I thought, well, it's just the beginning of the year. And then here's what I published, because if I'm going to talk about this, let me tell you how I dealt with it. I'm at home on Thursdays, and I got a letter, and it popped on my screen. They know I'm at home on Thursdays, and it about 11 o'clock, a letter came up from one of the sopranos, and it was long. She is one of the smarty pantses in the choir. She's also an incredible musician, and she wrote a 3-page letter. And basically, it's in the book. Basically, the letter started and said, "What's the matter with you? I didn't sign on for this. I find you frightening. I can't sing. What's the matter?" You can read the letter. It goes on. I published the whole letter. And then after they had this time, they had to, students, Mike, and Mark. I read the letter, and literally as I got done the letter, I got messages on my phone. "Can we meet with you now, today? Will you come into your office?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll be there in 25 minutes or whatever." So I go over. 5 section leaders are standing at the door, and they parade in quietly. They all sit down, they cross their arms and kind of look at me. And one says, "Did you get the letter?" I said, "Yeah." They said, "She's right." And I thanked them. I was not happy. And they were right. So what was happening is ego, thank you, Mark, thank you, Mako. I wanted to make this a great choir, and the hell with the humans in the room. I was going to bulldoze. And you know what I'm proud of? They didn't let me get away with it. They called my number as I would want them to. And what did I do? Went in, apologized. We talked a long time. And it was, what the root of it was? I was damn angry about what was going on with the school, to these students. And my counter was, "I'm going to make this great." Well, I didn't make it great. I kind of made a mess out of it. But that only lasted until they called the number. But I shared with them why, after a lot of analysis, why was I doing that? What was causing that? And I wasn't ashamed. I didn't say, you're all wrong, I'm fine. I wasn't fine. And I think that's part of the road in. So I put it in the book to show you that nobody's immune from this. No one. Anything else?
Yeah, we had a few other questions and we're running low on time. One of them was from Tim Friesen. What are some nonverbal ways to show gratitude?
Oh my God. So yes. You know what? Let me just start by the first one, and then I'll tell you, but very quickly. When I first started studying with Elaine Brown, I went in and my undergraduate teacher taught me, Mike, the ready position, which is this, Mike. Mike, you ready? So that's how I started. And I started, and Dr. Brown said, what are you doing? And I said, Dr. Brown, that's the ready position. And I don't know, Mike, if you know Elaine at all. She said, ready for what? She said, why can't you just put your arms open and welcome people? I think it's what's inside that people can read and read really well. I mean, we all teach technique. Mike and I teach technique. But in essence, we get really scared when that person doesn't come through and they're hiding behind their hands. I mean, it's breathing. I will swear to my dying day that people read breathing. They can sense things that I can't explain. So those are the two things. And the other thing that I don't want to scare Alec. Alec, don't fall over. But I'm almost done a book, and it's a result of all of this. And you know what it's about? Not once in my writing, not once have I ever written and used the word empathy. Never. Now, what's the matter with that? A lot. I mean, I think you have to understand that we are all empaths or have the gift of being that. But the door to that is a creaky open. And so, yeah. So that's what I'm working on now. And I think your question has to do with one's sense of empathy, where you become less so that others become more. Another question.
Great. Emily Steers asks, I'm a young singer-conductor at the beginning of my career, just finishing my MA. I'm still very uncertain and insecure of myself, and I'm excited and terrified to get started working with groups of students. How can I be vulnerable and respected when I'm fighting imposter syndrome and my own fear?
Weston Noble was teaching here in the summers with me for 13 years. He was an idol of mine. And when he retired from Luther after 57 years, I'm going to say that so you all heard me, 57 years at the same school and for many years doing the band and the choir, I looked at him and I love to prod him. And I said, Weston, after 57 years of teaching, give me a sentence about what it's all about. Now, what a stupid question. And I didn't know. You know what he answered? He looked at me with those blue eyes, sat up in the car, and he says, James, I can't answer you. He said, I think all I've done my whole life is affirm others. But he put up his finger and he says, but most importantly, he says, I affirm myself every day. And I think that is the root of it. I think love yourself first, and then all will be in order. I think it's all about work on yourself and think more of yourself than you do. None of us have all the answers. And I think that thing from Weston, affirm yourself daily. It's more than daily. Can I tell you? All of us, with Mike and I, you know, Mark, Mako too. I mean, you have to affirm yourself like it's like every 10 minutes. Otherwise, you could just go to a bad place. So great question. Thank you.
Wonderful. Shane Thomas asks, what are some of the ways you counter those moments when your ego won't allow you to be vulnerable?
Number one, Shane's another student of mine. Glad you're here, Shane. You and I have talked about this. I think it's loving your own gifts, breathing, finding a center. slow down. You're moving too fast. I think in those moments when you start to panic, you have to have tools to slow yourself. And I've talked about in grad conducting classes, but there is no silver bullet. Yoga may be a way, a daily practice or an every other day practice. I think for those of us who have to learn how to center and find our insides, our internal topography, for lack of a better term.
Wonderful. We'll just go another few minutes, just a couple more questions. Sonia Straley asks, children are born with a voice and they are not afraid to use it in self-expression. What then happens is children develop to hinder the voice. How can we as teachers and musicians counter that hindrance?
Okay, I have a viewpoint. I think the hindrance comes from music teachers who haven't done this kind of work to allow people to sing rather than make them sing. I think this is a big thing. With me, you cause people to sing, you don't make them sing. I know Mike believes this too. It's just, I just think that it's all about the person in front of the room and the human stuff that's flying around the room in the neurology. Children are aware, they read body language. I mean, think of this. A child knows 90%, I read somewhere that 90% of the information we get every day is not by what people say, but how they act and how they move. Children do this. I often call it the baby in the bucket syndrome. You go in the Starbucks, you sit down, well, you can't go now, but you go in, you sit down, you have a cup of coffee, and there's invariably a baby in a bucket there. And the baby is watching you, watching everything that you do. And they know the world before they can speak. They have a visual language. So anything we do with our bodies that's not connected internally comes out the body doesn't lie. It just doesn't.
Alan Denny says, what did you do differently after the students' confrontation?
Realized what I did wrong, forgave myself. I was raised Catholic, so I didn't go to confession, but I did forgive myself because it was one of those things. I self-analyzed what was the root of the problem, because it wasn't them. It wasn't their singing. And I had a kind of deep, back the car to the garage and figure out what could be the genesis of this. And then it doesn't go away. I can't get rid of that anger, as Mako said. I just acknowledge that it's there, and there it is. And they respected that. And you know what? The minute I did that and we started singing, the sound changed. It's changed on a dime. Any of them will tell you that. Any of them will tell you that.
Wonderful. And last question from Joseph Beck. Is the sound of your choir part of yourself?
Yes. Yes. Yes, Joe, it is. And you damn well know it. Joe sang in Westminster Choir with John Finlay Williamson. And one of Williamson's gift was, it was Williamson, but it was also kind of the respect for the humanity that's in the room, and that makes the sound. It's a synergy. It's not one or the other. It's this magical alchemy of stuff that happens. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I see we're past the hour. I just want to thank everyone on the panel for your incredible insights, your deep wisdom. I'm in awe of each and every one of you. And thank you so much for contributing to this amazing project. Thank you, Dr. Jordan, for all of your gifts, all of your passion, all of your musicianship, and for taking the time to put these ideas on paper where we can all read and reflect. I know we're going to post a video of this meeting so folks can share it. We're also going to post some bibliographical information, so the books and things that were referred to over the course of this hour. Folks will be able to see what those additional sources are. And I'll also send everybody on this panel the list of these questions that we weren't able to get to. So if you feel free, you can feel free to answer them as well after the vote. Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
Enjoy the rest of your evening. Stay safe, stay healthy. All the best.
Thank you all so very much. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.